Welcome back to Taka Tales. 3:42 in the morning. A county jail security camera captures a towering black figure circling an isolation cell. No face, no features, no movement from its legs. Just a living shadow gliding through the darkness. Multiple deputies saw it. At least one camera recorded it. And according to officers who work the graveyard shift, it always appeared after nights filled with despair. Tonight, you'll hear how one deputy went from laughing at the legend to checking every security monitor twice before walking the halls alone. And by the end of this story, you'll see why the most terrifying footage wasn't recorded inside the jail. It was recorded after the Shadow Man left it. Most county jails are loud, doors slam, inmates yell, phones ring, radios chatter constantly. There is always noise, always movement, always tension hanging in the air. But after midnight, everything changes. The shouting fades, the booking area empties, the phones stop ringing, and the entire building seems to settle into an uneasy silence. Officer Reyes learned that during his first few months working corrections at an aging Midwestern county jail, the building had been standing since the 1960s. Decades of violence, decades of suicides, decades of misery trapped behind concrete walls. Veteran deputies often joked that the jail absorbed suffering like a sponge. Every argument, every assault, every desperate inmate who had nowhere else to go. According to some of the older officers, the building remembered all of it. Reyes laughed the first time he heard that. He was young, practical. The kind of person who believed every strange story had a logical explanation. Old buildings made strange noises. Tired people imagined things. Fear filled in the gaps. That was all. At least that's what he thought. During his first week on nights, one of the senior deputies gave him a tour of the facility. As they walked through the booking area, the deputy casually pointed toward a dark hallway leading deeper into the jail. Try not to spend too much time down there by yourself after midnight. Reyes laughed. What, is it haunted? The deputy didn't laugh back. He simply kept walking. That reaction stuck with Reyes, because corrections officers joke about everything. Stress, violence, even death. Humor was how they survived the job. But whenever certain subjects came up, the jokes stopped. And one of those subjects was the Shadow Man. Every new deputy eventually heard the same warnings. Never work booking alone after midnight. Never investigate sudden cold spots. And if someone mentions the Shadow Man, don't ask questions. At first, Reyes thought it was nonsense. Every workplace has ghost stories. Hospitals have them. Fire stations have them. Police departments have them. Jails were no different. But there was something strange about how seriously the older deputies treated this one. Nobody laughed when it was mentioned. Nobody smiled. The room simply became quiet. And that silence bothered Reyes more than the story itself. Because these were people who dealt with violent inmates every day. People who had wrestled armed suspects. People who had walked into riots. People who had seen murders, overdoses, and suicides. Yet somehow, they seemed more uncomfortable discussing the Shadow Man than discussing actual criminals. Over the next few months, Reyes heard pieces of the legend from different deputies. The stories never matched perfectly. The locations changed, the witnesses changed, the years changed. But certain details never did. The figure was always impossibly tall, always completely black, and nobody ever saw a face. One deputy claimed he saw it standing at the far end of an empty corridor during a night shift storm. Another swore he caught a glimpse of it, reflected in a security door window before it vanished. A retired sergeant reportedly transferred to another facility after experiencing something he refused to discuss. Whenever Reyes asked for details, people became uncomfortable. Some would change the subject. Others would simply walk away. One veteran officer finally gave him the closest thing to an explanation. The deputy leaned back in his chair, and stared toward the security monitors. Then he said something Reyes would never forget. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "The shadow man never shows up on good nights." Reyes frowned. "What does that mean?" The deputy kept watching the monitors. "It only appears after something bad happens. A suicide attempt, a violent fight, a mental breakdown, an inmate getting terrible news from home. The stories always started the same way. Something horrible happened. Then someone saw the shadow man." The deputy shrugged as if he regretted saying anything. "Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe." But as the months passed, Reyes noticed something unsettling. Whenever officers discussed the shadow man, they weren't talking about it like a ghost. They talked about it like a person. Something that moved through the building. Something that watched. Something that waited. And despite all the rumors, all the stories, and all the warnings, Reyes never truly believed any of it. Not yet, because he'd never seen anything himself. At the time, he had no idea how quickly that was about to change. And he had no idea that the first person to introduce him to the shadow man wouldn't be a deputy at all. It would be an inmate sitting alone in an isolation cell. A few months later, a woman arrived during the early morning hours. She had been arrested after violently attacking officers during a domestic disturbance call. According to the arrest report, several deputies had struggled to restrain her. She screamed incoherently, kicked patrol car windows, threatened anyone who came near her, and repeatedly claimed that someone was following her. At first, officers assumed she was intoxicated or suffering from a mental health crisis. They had seen similar behavior before. Nothing about the arrest seemed unusual, at least not yet. The intake process was difficult. The woman refused to answer basic questions. She alternated between screaming and complete silence. One moment she was threatening deputies. The next, she was staring into empty space, as if listening to someone standing beside her. Several officers noticed the behavior, but nobody thought much of it. People arrived at county jail in all kinds of emotional states: fear, anger, panic, desperation. This was just another difficult booking, or so they believed. Because of her violent behavior and repeated attempts to harm herself, she was placed in an isolation cell inside the jail's special management unit. The cell was designed for constant observation. Multiple cameras, heavy reinforced doors, bright overhead lighting, no contact with other inmates, no personal belongings, no opportunities for self-harm. Everything inside the room could be monitored 24 hours a day. For the first several hours, nothing unusual happened. The woman paced, cried, occasionally shouted at deputies through the cell door. Then, sometime after midnight, her behavior changed. She became unusually quiet, almost too quiet. Instead of pacing, she sat motionless on her bunk, staring into the corner of the room. Minutes turned into hours, yet she barely moved. One deputy eventually approached the cell door and asked if she needed medical assistance. The woman didn't answer. She kept staring into the corner. Finally, she whispered something. At first, the deputy couldn't hear her. Then she spoke louder. "He's here." The deputy frowned. "Who's here?" The woman slowly pointed toward the corner of the cell. "That man." The deputy looked. There was nothing there, just concrete walls and fluorescent lights. The woman continued staring. "He won't stop watching me." The deputy assumed she was hallucinating. The explanation seemed obvious: stress, mental illness, isolation. But over the next several nights, the woman kept describing the same figure. Not to deputies, not to herself, to someone else. As though she were carrying on conversations with a person nobody else could see. Whenever officers asked what she was looking at, her answer never changed. A tall black figure standing inside the cell. A man with no face, no eyes, no mouth, no visible features at all, just darkness. Night after night, she repeated the same description. 7 feet tall, featureless, gliding instead of walking, circling her bunk repeatedly, watching her, waiting, The consistency was unusual. Most hallucinations changed over time. Details shifted, descriptions evolved. But hers never did. Every answer remained identical. One evening, a deputy asked her what the figure wanted. The woman immediately stopped talking. Her expression changed. Fear replaced anger. For several seconds, she simply stared at the floor. Then she quietly replied, "I don't think it wants anything." The deputy felt a chill run through him. "Then why is it here?" The woman slowly looked toward the corner again and whispered, "Because someone else was here before me." That answer stayed with the deputy long after his shift ended. But nobody truly believed her. Not yet. The woman was clearly disturbed. The logical explanation was still the most likely one, until a deputy, reviewing security footage, noticed something that should not have been there. And that's when everything changed. Imagine sitting alone in a dark control room. Multiple security monitors glow across the wall. Most of the screens show absolutely nothing. Empty hallways, locked doors, sleeping inmates. Hour after hour of footage that nobody expects to become important. For corrections officers, reviewing security recordings is usually one of the most boring parts of the job. The same hallways, the same cells, the same routine. But sometimes, something appears, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. A few nights after the woman began describing the faceless figure, one deputy decided to review the isolation cell footage. Not because he believed her story. Quite the opposite. He wanted to prove she was imagining everything. The deputy pulled up several hours of recordings from the special management unit. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The woman sat on her bunk, occasionally paced the room, sometimes stared into the corner she always pointed toward. Everything looked normal. Then the timestamp reached approximately 2:51 a.m. And that's when something changed. At first, the deputy thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A dark shape appeared near the corner of the cell. Not a camera shadow, not a reflection, a shape, humanoid, standing perfectly still. The deputy immediately paused the recording. He leaned closer to the monitor, trying to understand what he was seeing. Maybe another inmate somehow appeared on camera. Maybe a correctional officer had entered the cell. Maybe the camera itself was malfunctioning. He rewound the footage, played it again. The shape remained. He rewound it a second time, still there. A third time. Nothing changed. The figure never disappeared. It stood motionless in the corner of the isolation cell. Watching, the deputy reportedly felt a chill run through him. Not because he believed in ghosts, but because he couldn't explain what he was seeing. Then the figure moved. Slowly, methodically. It began circling the inmate's bunk. One lap, then another, then another. Its movements looked wrong, almost unnatural. There was no visible walking motion, no clear movement of the legs. The figure seemed to glide across the floor, as if it wasn't actually touching the ground. The deputy watched in silence, unable to look away. The woman never reacted. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She simply sat on the bunk staring forward, as if she already knew it was there. As if this wasn't the first time she had seen it. The figure never touched her, never spoke, never made a sound. It simply moved around her, watching, waiting. The deputy began checking other camera angles. Different views of the same cell. Different recording feeds. The figure appeared in every one. Always dark, always featureless. Almost like a human silhouette cut from pure blackness. He zoomed in. The image became blurry, but the shape, the closer he looked, the less sense it made. No facial features, no visible clothing, no details at all. Just darkness. Eventually, the deputy called another officer into the control room. Then another, then another. Soon, several deputies were gathered around the monitor. Nobody said much. The room was unusually quiet. Each officer searched for a logical explanation. A camera glitch, a compression artifact, a lighting problem, anything. But no explanation seemed to fit. One deputy reportedly suggested checking the camera system itself. The equipment was inspected. No issues were found. The recording was reviewed again and again and again. The figure remained exactly where it had been the first time, watching the inmate, circling her bunk, waiting. For many officers, that footage marked the first moment they truly became uncomfortable. Not because they believed in the supernatural, but because they couldn't explain what they were looking at. And in a building where explanations mattered, that was far more disturbing. But while the footage itself was unsettling, what happened afterward was even worse. Because within weeks, deputies who had watched the recording began reporting encounters of their own. And soon, the shadow man wasn't staying inside the camera anymore. Stories began spreading across night shift. One deputy reported seeing his breath in an otherwise warm hallway. Another heard footsteps behind him, heavy, wet, dragging. Yet every time he turned around, nobody was there. Then came the strangest reports. Several officers described feeling someone standing directly behind them, not nearby, not across the room, right behind them, close enough to touch. Every instinct screamed that another person was present, but whenever they turned around, empty space. One veteran deputy experienced it during routine cell checks. He felt the sensation so strongly that he spun around immediately. Nothing, just an empty corridor. Hours later, he reviewed the hallway camera, and according to him, the footage showed a dark figure standing inches behind him, matching every movement, mirroring him, like a reflection detached from reality. After that incident, even skeptical officers became uncomfortable. The shadow man wasn't staying inside one cell. It appeared wherever suffering was strongest. After suicide attempts, after violent fights, after emotional breakdowns, as if something inside the building was responding to pain or feeding on it. And then the footage nobody could explain. The same inmate remained in isolation. Another difficult night unfolded. Reports of self-harm, emotional distress, hours of crying. Then, shortly after 4 a.m, cameras captured the figure again. This time it appeared larger, much larger. The shadow occupied nearly half the cell. It slowly circled the bunk. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. Then it stopped. The inmate looked directly toward it. For nearly 30 seconds, neither moved. The footage was completely silent. No sudden motion, no dramatic effects. Just a human being sitting on a bunk and a towering shadow standing before her. Then the figure turned, moved toward the wall, and walked directly through solid concrete. No hesitation, no interruption. It simply passed through. The hallway camera picked it up seconds later. Still moving, still gliding, still impossibly dark. Then another camera captured it, crossing the staff parking lot. Rain covered the asphalt. Everything reflected in the wet pavement. Everything except the figure. It moved farther away, growing taller, stretching upward, then slowly lifted from the ground, higher, 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 until it disappeared into the darkness above the jail. The footage was reviewed multiple times. Official explanations ranged from camera glitches to lighting anomalies. But among the deputies who saw it, nobody truly believed those explanations, because too many people had experienced the same thing. Years later, Officer Reyes would leave corrections. Not because of violent inmates, not because of the stress, not because of the long nights. He left because he could never shake the feeling that something else worked those halls. Something that didn't wear a uniform. Something that didn't need keys. Something that never clocked out. The shadow man always appeared after suffering, after despair, after hopelessness. And according to those who worked graveyard shift, that was never a coincidence. Maybe it was a haunting. Maybe it was something darker. Or maybe certain places collect so much human pain that eventually something begins feeding on it. If you've ever worked corrections, law enforcement, security, or overnight shifts, and experience something you still can't explain, leave your story below. The next Taka Tales episode might be yours. Until next time, keep an eye on the shadows, because they might already be watching you.